And now that we're like 20 minutes late, we're going to have Peggy Cooney come up. Peggy Cooney is one of the original founders of the symposium. I asked her if she wanted to speak, and she said no, but I talked her into introducing Omowale, so that worked out pretty well. So you're going to get to hear from both of them. It's my very great honor to have Peggy and Omowale here to give this talk today, so thank you.
Christy and Michelle have been thanking a lot of people, so let's thank them for being wonderful chairs this year. I'm pleased to introduce the 2016 Shepard Symposium on Social Justice closing keynote speaker, Dr. Omowale Akintunde. Dr. Akintunde was a faculty member in the College of Education at the University of Wyoming from 1996 to 1999. Dr. Akintunde went on to earn a filmmaking degree at the New York Film Academy. He writes and produces films, publishes books, and most of all, impacts people throughout the world, including his students at the University of Nebraska, Omaha, where he is currently a faculty member in the Department of Black Studies. Our paths crossed 20 years ago in 1996 here at the University of Wyoming in a remarkable way. As a colleague in the college, Omowale asked me to join him in an ambitious project to co-chair a symposium for the eradication of social inequality. He proposed that we introduce our elementary education students to the way American schooling as a social system can perpetuate an unfair environment for teaching and learning. This premise states that according to a student's race, class, and/or gender, he or she is either treated as privileged or lacking. Our task was to help teacher education students who were from predominantly white middle class and rural backgrounds understand the experience of being American Indian, Mexican American, Asian American, African American, poor, or female. Dr. Akintunde and I, often in partnership with the law school dean, thanks to Jerry Parkinson, I'm sure he's here, launched the tradition of hosting famous keynote speakers who talk eloquently of the path to social justice. Now, Omowale, you have joined this group of inspiring advocates. Please welcome Dr. Omowale Akintunde.
Is this? Okay. Well, let me first start off by saying the trip here was a lot better than the last time when I came. They have a real jet that brings you here now, you know? Do you all remember that single engine prop plane that everybody had to get on? I mean, that thing was awful. And I don't care how much you think you know how awful it was. This was like really scary. On takeoff, you could literally see the pilot in the cockpit. You know, put the clutch down, and then a bunch of guys get in the back of the plane and push it down the tarmac and try to jump start it. So we've come a long way since then. But that's not the main reason the trip was so much better this time. When I came last time, I was coming from Evansville because I was a professor at the University of Southern Indiana at the time. And I was teaching in a teacher education program. And I was teaching the multicultural education stuff. So when I came that year, I had also been invited to Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Have you ever been there? It's a really ritzy place. And so I was coming here, and then I was leaving here, and I was flying there. So I knew I was going to be gone for quite a few days. And, it was the end of the semester. I had a lot of papers to grade. So I decided, I'm going to take the papers with me, and I'll grade them on the plane on my way there, right? So I get on the plane in Evansville, en route to Denver. I take my seat. I get my stuff out, my red pen, my papers, and I start grading papers. And, down the road was the flight attendant, pushing that cart. I hate that cart. Because, they always open a can of Coke on, like, row 3, and then want you to drink the remaining Coke on row 33. And so she comes down with the cart and everything. And I'm sitting there grading papers, and I look up, and she was giving me the look. Now, let me tell you about the look. For just a moment, I got to talk to the black people. You know the look I'm talking about. The one white people give you when they get ready to say something totally stupid. No, listen. Let me give you an example. I had invited some friends to my house, right, to play cards. And I was going to make a big pot of spaghetti. Now, let me tell you something. Whether you know it or not, black people's spaghetti and white people's spaghetti are two totally different things. No, seriously. Like, when my mom made spaghetti, there were bell peppers and onion and celery and garlic, and all that had to be sauteed, and then the ground beef, and then she would take the pasta and break it up and put it in the boiling water. When I was a little boy, if I was really good, she'd let me break the pasta up. And then she would bring it all together in this big pot with the sauce and everything. It was just absolutely amazing. So, since I was going to make my spaghetti, I had to go to Walmart, because that's where I go to do all my shopping, because I need to get my fresh peppers and stuff, right? So I get in the produce section, and I'm looking at the bell peppers and everything, and, picking out the very best I could find. And I look over to my right, and there's this little white lady staring at me, right? So I was like, okay, why is the white lady staring at me? So I just kept doing what I was doing, and I tried to pretend I didn't see her, but I kept looking out of the corner, of my eyes, and she was just looking up at me, smiling, and I'm like, what is she doing? So I keep on picking out the stuff, and so finally she walks up to me and she says, I think President Obama is doing a great job. I was like, what? I don't even know you. And I'm thinking, why do you need to tell me that, I'll tell him when I get home tonight. I know he and Michelle are sitting at the table drinking Coke 45, waiting on me to bring the cards so they can start the spades game. So I'm sitting in my seat on the plane, and the flight attendant was giving me that same look. So I pretended to still be grading my papers. So finally she says, oh, what are you doing? I said, I'm grading papers. She says, oh, what grade do you teach? I said, I don't teach a grade. She says, how is that? I said, well, I'm a university professor. Then she says, oh, I would have never guessed that. Oh, I let that slide. I pick my battles now. I let that slide. But she kept on. So she says, well, what do you teach at the university? And I'm thinking, oh my God, it's getting ready to get thick now because, I got to tip out my work and stuff. So I says, I teach multicultural education. She says, oh, wow, I love it. She says, I just believe in diversity. Absolutely. She says, I have 2 sons. One is 7 and one is 9. And she said, from the day they were born, I taught them to be colorblind. I told them that people are going to tell you that black people are not good people, but I told them black people are just as good as we are. So I looked at her, And she says, so I'm really into diversity. She says, but you know, there's one thing I just really don't understand. So now I put the pen down. She says, I just don't understand why people are so against the president wanting to build a wall. Now, this was during the Bush administration years, okay? And if you recall, Bush was saying he wanted to build a wall too. And she says, I just don't get how that's insensitive or prejudiced. She says, I think we should do that. And she says, but I bet you probably don't like President Bush, do you? I said, well, it's not so much that I don't like him. I tried to, but try though I may, I just couldn't bring myself to like a man I honestly felt had to be naked to count to 21. It went over her head too. But she kept on. So she says, so you're telling me you don't think it's a good idea to build a wall to protect our border? I said, absolutely not. And she says, well, may I ask why? I said, well, frankly, I think it would offend the Canadians. Then she got a little card. But seriously, we're currently embroiled in a difficult political environment where we have a movement self-described as right-wing Christian conservatives who seem to feel as if the country is being pushed in what they regard as the wrong direction. Now, personally, I feel that it is incumbent upon me to critique this assertion, as it has deep repercussions for how this country regards minoritized people, to include the LGBT community as well as people of color. Therefore, I feel it is all too appropriate that I address the current political environment and its leaders and how their platform is influencing how these populations are being regarded by the greater population and subsequently influences how legislation ultimately determines quality of life for disenfranchised peoples. In case you didn't get that, I'm getting ready to talk about Donald Trump and the Republican Party. Not because I have any personal agenda or vendetta, mind you, but rather because it is pertinent to the topics I'm going to cover today. So, if during my delivery anyone feels that I'm enjoying talking about Mr. Trump and the Republican Party, you should know that I'm doing this purely as a public intellectual whose duty is to enlighten the general populace, and that I am not deriving any pleasure at all from this. Now let's start with Donald Trump and the Republicans. Now, I know there's a political divide in this country, and that we're basically dealing with two different paradigms in terms of Republican versus Democrat philosophy. But I just don't see how anyone doesn't see any of the positive that has transpired under the Obama presidency in the last 7 years. They've done everything to minimize this president's and his administration's legacy, and despite all of his accomplishments, they still want to assert that he has not been an effective president, when in fact, the truth of the matter is, when President Obama took office, it was in the midst of the housing bubble burst and what many have regarded as the most serious economic crisis since the Great Depression. When Bush left office, according to the Washington Post, the economy had lost over 1 million jobs, making him the only president in U.S. history to lose jobs during his presidency. The unemployment rate was 10%. Osama bin Laden was alive and well we were embroiled in 2 wars on foreign soil, one of which was built on the lie that there were weapons of mass destruction, armed and pointed at American throats, which, as we now know, was not only a lie, but, as reported by U.S. News, sucked $10 billion a month from the economy for over 10 years and cost us over 32,000 American lives. In our auto industry, for decades, the pride of Americans had collapsed. Now let's compare. Under the present administration, 13 million jobs have been created, which is the highest job growth since 1984. The unemployment rate has been cut in less than half, from 10% to 4.9%. The automobile industry was saved, and Osama bin Laden is dead. Then, just last month, I was watching the Republican debate, and there on international television stood Donald Trump behind his podium bragging on how big his penis is. And I thought to myself, I know they want to beat the president at something, but they know the president is black. Surely they don't think they can beat him in that category. Now, whereas I enjoy watching, you guys, I'm just keeping it real. Now, whereas I enjoy watching the Republican Party implode right before our very eyes, I can't help but also wonder how it is that the so-called establishment Republicans are so shocked by Donald Trump. They created him. All Trump is doing is saying out loud what they have always believed and supported. His followers aren't a new group of people. They are the Republican Party, their voting constituency. Donald Trump is not making Republicans from scratch. These are the same Republicans voting for him that have always been there. These are the people who fought marriage equality, who fought abortion reform, who fought providing reproductive health care and access to contraceptives for women, who fought universal health care as a right for all citizens, who fought religious freedom for others while maintaining that it is a core Christian right. Trump has just energized the Republican voting constituency by finally saying what the establishment would only say through a wink and a nod. What is it that Donald Trump is saying that Republicans didn't already believe? He thinks Mexicans are rapists and murderers, gays don't deserve the right to marry, and blacks are responsible for our own disenfranchisement and oppression. He doesn't want health care for everyone or college. He says the president is a Muslim, an illegal alien born in Kenya. Did you hear that, Dr. Kambudu? In fact, Senator Sessions from Alabama, Sheriff Arpaio of Arizona, David Duke, and white supremacists in general, they all love him and have endorsed him. And by they, I mean the Republican constituency. I have repeatedly heard since that infamous interview on CNN where Trump, A, claimed on Sunday that he didn't know anything about white supremacists or David Duke, and then B, later said he disavowed David Duke the Friday before the Sunday interview where he said he didn't know who he was. But my thing is, I don't care when or if you disavowed the Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan support. What I wonder is, why would the leader of the Ku Klux Klan want to endorse you in the first place? Why you, Mr. Trump? What is it about you that the Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan finds so endearing that he wants to support and endorse your presidency? What is it about you, Mr. Trump, that would cause the Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan to pay for thousands of robocalls, urging your Republican constituents to vote for you? In fact, why is it, do you think, Mr. Trump, that David Duke, leader of the Ku Klux Klan, is a member of the Republican Party in the first place? David Duke isn't just some supporter. He has run for several political offices as a Republican in the past, to include a seat in the House of Representatives, governor of Louisiana, senator from Louisiana, and get this, the Republican nominee for the president of these United States. What is it that white supremacists find so endearing about you? Trump hasn't hijacked the Republican Party. He simply highlighted their agenda. And now the so-called Republican establishment are ashamed. Why is that? I'll tell you why. They hear what their rhetoric played out to its obvious conclusion sounds like, and they're ashamed and embarrassed. That's how I know they always knew how ridiculously hateful they sounded, because if they didn't, why would they be ashamed to hear Trump openly espouse their platform? Now, the so-called Republican establishment, people like Mitt Romney, Jeb Bush, and Lindsey Graham, are trying to bring down their own frontrunner, but they can't, because the Republican voting constituency that has given Trump victory after victory after victory is not going to leave him and come back to them, because they know they, meaning the Republican establishment, won't say and are too scared to say what they really feel, because they realize how ridiculously stupid they would look if they did. They look like Donald Trump. A classic catch-22, and I'm loving it. So, in my mind, the only difference between David Duke and Donald Trump is that David Duke, as a Klansman, wore a hood and burned crosses in the middle of the night. Donald Trump is the functional equivalent of a Klansman, but has the nerve to take off his hood and burn his cross in broad daylight. So, here we have Donald Trump, a white Republican presidential candidate who has blown the dog whistle for all white supremacists to hear, and apparently black Christian evangelicals share the same wavelength. There's a reason why David Duke, the Ku Klux Klan, and all of these other white supremacist groups are in love with Donald Trump. Anyone short of a frontal lobotomy knows that he has sent out a thinly veiled coded message to angry, disaffected white people, and that most curious of curiosities, the black Republican, and I'll get back to them shortly, telling them that he's going to take their country back. These are the people who are disgusted with 8 years of a black president, restored diplomatic relations with the rest of the world, an administration that has repaired and salvaged our economy, supported gay people earning civil rights, and they are mad. And now they have a voice. A white man who is not afraid to stand up and take their heretofore kitchen table talk to primetime television, saying things like, let's build a wall to keep Mexicans out of our country. And just for the record, the so-called Mexicans were here when the white Europeans arrived. They are the indigenous Americans. The white people are the immigrants that drew a borderline and declared them aliens. And you, Mr. Black Republican, came on the boat too. Except you were underneath it, chained to your fellow Africans en route to nearly 4 centuries of United States government-sanctioned enslavement and second-class citizenry that remains to this day. And now, the slave owner and the slave both are following a white man who promises to build a wall to keep Mexicans out of the America in which they are the indigenous people. In my mind, this is what happens when a society is dumbed down and brainwashed into blind acquiescence. Donald Trump, this Bible-thumping, hate-mongering demagogue, is going to cause this country to erupt with the hate and ignorance he's spewing. But get ready for this. Jeb Bush, his supposed rival, recently said on CNN that he supports building walls at the Mexican border too, and also repudiated the Pope for saying the following about Donald Trump, that, quote, a person who thinks only about building walls, wherever they may be, and not building bridges is not Christian. This support of Donald Trump building a wall to keep Mexicans out and repudiation of the Pope is coming from Jeb Bush, a man who is married to a Mexican and has children with her and has been constantly attacked by Trump. Now, you all know how much I support and believe in our president. But this is one time I'm going to have to say I have to disagree with something he said. The president has said that the American people are, quote, too sensible, unquote, to elect Trump president. Of this, I am not so sure. Donald Trump says he's going to make America great again. What he's really saying in code is that he's going to make America white again. What I can't figure out is how white people have come to the conclusion that their greatness has been taken away in the first place. For example, I'm a professor in the Black Studies Department at the University of Nebraska, and it never ever fails. Every semester, some young white male raises his hand and says to me, "Why do you guys get to have a Black Studies Department? If the white students here had a white studies department, we'd be called white supremacists and white racists. White people can't show their pride. We can't have a white studies department." What I want to say at this point is, you moron, we do have a white studies department. It's called the University of Nebraska. You are the norm. You're it. You're the standard by which we become other. They don't get that the world, which is undefined, is white. So what I do is this. I have them take out a sheet of paper and create what they feel would constitute their white studies department. I tell them that the white studies department will have the following courses: white American history, white psychology, white music history, white art history, whites in the political world, and whites in science. Then I ask them to, underneath each category, list and describe famous white people and events that they would have in each of these courses. So I start with, create your own white American history course. Tell me who all the famous people were in white American history that you feel absolutely have to be included in this course. I tell them to list all the things and events you think should be in that course. Now, at this point, some of them are getting it. Because they realize that if they created a course called White American History, it would be the same damn course they're taking now called American History. So these are the kinds of things they say they would cover in the White American History course. They say the course would describe every president, starting with George Washington. They say that in their white psychology course, they would study Piaget, Erikson, Skinner, Freud. In their white science class, they would study Albert Einstein, Carl Sagan, Alexander Graham Bell. In their white music history department, they would study Mozart, Bach, Brahms. Now, at this point, they really started to get angry because they realized they are the undefined world, that white has become so normal, so neutral, so systemically and epistemologically entrenched that the white experience has become the human experience, and that white and human being mean the same thing. One time I had this white boy who, in response to this activity, simply came back the next day and he said an American history book, his music history book, his music appreciation book, his art history book, and his science book on my desk, paused and said, "Okay, I get it." I love those little victories. White people don't see their whiteness. They don't see their privilege. It has become invisible to them, to the point that they want to assert that their country is being taken from them and that they are not represented in the culture, while the blacks, the gays, and the Mexicans get to have their own departments at universities, their own television stations like BET and Telemundo, their own History Month. And what do whites have? Nothing. You do have White History Month. It's the remaining 11 months. We have BET and you have WET. Only they are called CBS, ABC, CNN, and the most white of them all, FOX. You are the narrative. We only exist as a counter-narrative to your norm. White is the default space that only exists as a counter-narrative to your norm. White people and whiteness itself, rather than being seen for what they are, historically evolved social constructions, have now become inherent social norms. And as a result, white and human being mean the same thing. And so Donald Trump has manipulated this belief among white people that they no longer exist, that their America's being taken from them. And he, in his almighty grace and wisdom, is going to bring them back, fix everything, make America white again. This is because they don't see they're already there. When we say we want more diversity, that doesn't mean we want more white people. When we say we want diversity, it means we want somebody else in there besides white people, because white people are already assumed to be there. It's their presence that makes us other. You are the implied, omnirelevant, omnipresent norm. Being black is not a card we play. We're black 24/7 in a white racist society that has become so normal, so neutral, that the possessors of it no longer see it. Being gay is not a card we play. Being female is not a card you play. There is a reason why we don't have a white studies department, a straight studies department, a men's studies department, a Christian studies department. You are the standard by which the other becomes other. You don't need a space. You are space. What Trump has done is he has taken the societal misunderstanding among white people and manipulated it into a political movement. And that's why David Duke, the Republican voting constituency and white Christian evangelicals love him. And while we're at it, let me tell you why they really don't like Obamacare. What's making them angry is the idea that you would provide health care to despicable, lazy degenerates that want to be healthy for free, and that's unacceptable to them. even if it means not having the right for themselves. Trump has convinced them that despite the fact that he is a multi-billionaire, that he's one of them. They are the same because they're all white, and that's what bonds them in a world where what used to be the slave is now the president. And what used to be so despicable can now marry and have all the benefits that were available to only straight people. Where Jesus was supreme and God was supreme, and now we're actually asserting that Muslims should be treated as equals. Now that the people who were cut off and lines drawn to keep them out are now saying they have a right to be in their country, they are angry. And now someone, one of them, has finally done what they've always wanted from their party, who will actually say what they all truly feel, and has taken that kitchen table talk to primetime television for all to see and hear. And they love him. Donald Trump has even bragged that he could take out a gun in broad daylight in the middle of Fifth Avenue, in the heart of New York City, commit murder, and his Republican voting constituency won't leave him. His narcissistic arrogance is not exaggerated, however. It's true. They don't care what he says or does. He's their savior, their Messiah, their path to make America white, Christian, straight, and male-dominated again. The saddest thing about all of this is those spaces he's promising to bring back have never left. And now I want to come back, as promised, to that most curious of curiosities, the Black Republican. Because I'm sure you're sitting there asking, if this has become our reality, and white has become our reality, what's in this for a black person? Why would a black person want to be a Republican? What do they have to gain here? You're probably thinking there's something not quite right with David Duke, the Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, and Ben Carson, a black man who by his own account grew up in poverty in a single-parent household, belonged to the same party. Black people have allowed the bonds of religion to brainwash them to praying to invisible white men, despite incontestable evidence that mankind began in Africa, and that the oldest human fossils found in Ethiopia, ironically named Lucy, over 4 billion years ago now assert that the earth is a convenient 6,000 years old, and that humans were born in a mythic paradise called Eden. Why is this relevant? Well, I'll tell you. If you can get people to swallow an irrational fiction as truth, they can be convinced of anything else. That even as the polar ice caps melt and the global temperature is rising at an alarming rate, that there really is no such thing as global warming. You can convince them that the senseless murder of black men week after week after week for such silly things as selling loose cigarettes is due to the inherent sociopathy of black people. Rather than recognizing the institutional reality of white supremacy, they instead assert that racism is an abstract event that one elects to make it happen by playing the race card, because there is no racism unless one evokes it. That racism and white privilege are institutionalized and systemically entrenched into every vestige of our reality is a lie. Yet they assert that the problem isn't racism, but racist. And if we got rid of them and made it taboo to pronounce the word nigger in any context, is how we eliminate racism. How we can all become one race, one people. How we can all become white. But they can't see that, because deeply embedded in the psyche of our culture, white and human being are the same thing. For example, In 1967, it was illegal for blacks to marry whites. The reason white society insisted was not due to any personal hatred they had for black people. They insisted they were just following the Bible and doing God's work. So when Richard Loving, a white man, and Mildred, his black wife, traveled to Washington, D.C. to marry in June of 1958, thereby evading Virginia's Racial Integrity Act of 1924, which made marriage between whites and blacks a crime, history was about to be made. Based on an anonymous tip, local police raided their home at night, hoping to find them having sex, which was also a crime, according to Virginia law, that deemed sex between black and white people an act of bestiality. I'm not making this up. So when the officers found the Lovings sleeping in their bed, Mildred pointed out their marriage certificate on the bedroom wall. That very certificate became the evidence for the criminal charge of, quote, cohabitating as man and wife against the peace and dignity of the Commonwealth that was brought against them. Now, on January 6, 1959, the Lovings pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 1 year in prison and 5 years probation. The Lovings appealed their conviction, and their case went all the way to the Virginia Supreme Court, where their conviction was upheld, and Chief Justice Leon Bazile, representing the majority, wrote the following. Almighty God created the races, white, black, yellow, Malay, and red, and he placed them on separate continents. And but for the interference with his arrangement, there would be no cause for such marriages. The fact that he separated the races shows that he did not intend for the races to mix, unquote. Now, if you believe God placed people on separate continents so they wouldn't marry white people, that's your prerogative. Perhaps if God knew that race was a social construction and that the continents were once one landmass called Pangea, he would have deemed black people human enough to marry white people. You have every right to believe anything you wish. What you don't have is the right to impose your religious beliefs on everyone else as perfect and violate truths, and then concretize those beliefs as the law of the land. But back to the Lovings. The Lovings, undeterred, filed another appeal, which after 6 years of legal battle was agreed to be heard by the nation's highest judiciary, the Supreme Court, which reversed Virginia's Supreme Court decision as unconstitutional. Chief Justice Warren, speaking for the majority, wrote the following, quote, marriage is one of the basic civil rights of man, fundamental to our very existence and survival. To deny this fundamental freedom on so unsupportable a basis as the racial classifications embodied in these statutes, classifications so directly subversive of the principle of equality at the heart of the 14th Amendment, is surely to deprive all the state citizens of liberty without due process of law. It was a 5-4 decision, which might help us understand why Republicans led by House Speaker Paul Ryan, minutes after conservative Chief Justice Antonin Scalia was pronounced dead, went on Fox News and said, not only would they not confirm any person whatsoever that President Obama nominated to fill Chief Justice Scalia's position on the court, in an unprecedented display of political vitriol, declared that not only would they not confirm any person whatsoever that President Obama presented as his nominee, they weren't even going to allow his nominee to come before them to be struck down. And so in 1967, the Lovings prison sentence for engaging in interracial marriage was reversed, and the right for blacks to marry white people became the law of the land. However, in 2001, God was back at it again. This time, the problem was the gays. Now they wanted to get married. The nation and its courts refused to grant or recognize such marriages. The reason? The Bible says it's not what God wanted. This time, it took several years and several court cases before the Supreme Court would hear Obergefell versus Hodges. President Obama wrote a brief to the Supreme Court urging them to strike down laws prohibiting gay marriage. The nation waited with bated breath. Then, on June 26, 2015, the Supreme Court, citing that very Loving versus Virginia 1967 decision, tore down that barrier, thus affording gay people the right to marry just like anyone else. The president, leader of the free world, in celebration of this monumental event, and let me tell you, I still haven't gotten over this yet, folk, lit the White House, the symbol of Western democracy itself, in gay rainbow colors. Well, the religious right is angry, really, really angry. We once again defied the Bible and God, and worse yet, under the administration of a black president. The very entity that had been enslaved for 3 centuries by white society, and who just 50 years ago was declared an animal and denied the right to marry a white person. What was this world coming to? Negroes in the White House? Gays getting married? Footnote, by the way, this is what I find most incredible of it all. Some black people, the ones enslaved and denied the right to marry white people according to that same Bible, are now waving that same Bible in protest of gay marriage. As Paulo Freire says in his classic work, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, there are few things more vile and incomprehensible than when the victims of hatred, bigotry, and oppression become themselves haters, bigots, and oppressors. Now enters Donald Trump, waving that Bible, quoting passages from 2 Corinthians. Before tens of thousands of angry people who've come to hear him speak. And although those crowds consist almost totally of white people, if you squint, you will actually see some black Republicans sprinkled in the crowd. And so what you see here now at these Trump rallies is the white European colonizer and the slaves he transported to build his nation standing side by side in solidarity, defending their country against the indigenous people who, ironically, they now refer to as immigrants and illegal aliens. Before I conclude, I promise to talk about guns. I gotta go there. When Sandy Hook happened and this guy comes in and slaughters children, I thought, surely that would be a wake-up call. But not for these idiots who still want to maintain that having access to an AR-17 assault rifle and the mint stores of ammunition are somehow their Second Amendment right. I want to talk about how ridiculous it is that in South Carolina to vote, they require a background check because convicted felons can't vote and government-issued ID. But you can order a gun online and have it delivered to your house. What sense does that make? So this is what we have here. You need state-issued ID and a background check to vote, but you can order an AK-47 and hundreds of rounds of ammunition from the internet on your iPad while watching Bill O'Reilly on Fox News simply by hitting enter. How could you not see what's underneath that? Sometimes in the middle of the night, I bolt upright and I just scream at the insidiousness of it all. Is this really happening? Sometimes I can't believe what I'm experiencing. It's that feeling of out of placeness, like a bastard child at a family reunion. You know, Peggy and I co-founded this conference way back in 1996. It was our little effort to try and combat the lunacy of inequality in the world. It was called the Symposium for the Eradication of Social Inequality back then. Our first conference was in what was the dining hall. Our audience was the student and teacher education program. From that, it grew to a full-fledged conference with multiple presentations from academics throughout the nation. But this, I never thought it could be anything like this. This is so incredibly larger than anything I could have ever imagined. Peggy and I were just trying to do something to help our students understand the importance of addressing social inequality as teachers. As I recall, Peggy and I were the only presenters. Now, you bring some of the most renowned names in the battle for social inequality. I'm truly humbled to be here. You'll never know how much I appreciate your acknowledgement. I think I can speak for Peggy and myself that neither one of us could have ever imagined that our brainchild would evolve to this. I was a professor here when Matthew Shepard was killed. I won't ever forget looking out the window of my office in McWhinney Hall, hearing the shouts, stuff like, Matthew Shepard is in hell. God hates fags. It was the protesters from Westboro Baptist Church, under the leadership of their pastor, Reverend Fred Phelps. And as if the hateful shouts were not powerful enough, they all had signs that read stuff like, AIDS cures fags, death penalty for fags, God still hates fags. So I watched the protesters who had traveled many, many miles to spew this hate in loud, angry voices. You know, Westboro Baptist Church website is godhatesfags.com. I'm serious, look it up. However, in the middle of these protesters, ensuring us that God hates fags, was a group of students covered in all white. They looked as if they were on stilts, and they had wings that spread out and upwards above their heads, and they were holding signs too. Signs that read things like peace, hope, and be the change. What a curious sight. It was like the curious sight I talked about earlier. You know, black Republicans at a Donald Trump rally, cheering as he stood on the stage, having been endorsed by David Duke of the KKK, talking of his hate of Mexicans, and black Republicans cheering him on. Can you imagine that? The ludicrousness and the contradiction of it all. I felt like a chicken at a KFC convention. It just didn't make sense. I stepped back from my office window and sat at my desk and stared blankly at the wall. I thought about Matthew Shepard, a young, idealistic boy just starting in life, attending college. I pictured him going to classes, laughing with friends, full of the hope that young people have who are moving towards that bright future. But then, I pictured Matthew screaming, begging for his life. I pictured his skull and his dreams being crushed at the hands of two angry men, delivering blow after blow after blow. And I thought, what was Matthew thinking in those moments? As he felt his life, as he literally felt his life being taken from him. And then I pictured him hung on a fence, crucified in the bitter cold of a Wyoming winter night and left to die. Have you ever cried and didn't even realize you were crying until you tasted something salty in the corners of your mouth? I wish that I could tell Matthew of the sorrow I felt, how sad I was for him. And then I pictured him hung on a fence, literally felt his life being taken from him. How sad I was for him. I wish that I could tell Matthew of the sorrow I felt, but I couldn't. He was dead now. But then I remembered watching an episode of Oprah, and she had Dr. Phil on. This was before Dr. Phil became Dr. Phil. And it concerned the family that had been torn apart by the actions of their now deceased father. A father that had repeatedly battered their mother, who had raped all of his daughters from preschool age into their teens, who had once actually shot the son who was defending his mother as he beat her. I remember Dr. Phil telling them that they should write that father a letter, which they obviously found quite perplexing. After all, their father was now dead. What use, they said, will writing him a letter achieve them now? That's when Dr. Phil told them that the letter wasn't for him. The letter is for you, to get it all out, to release the rage and the sorrow and the hurt and the pain and the feeling of helplessness. That's when I sat down at my desk, I took out a pad, grabbed a pen, and wrote what would eventually be published in the Journal of the National Association of Multicultural Education, entitled A Letter to Matthew. Dear Matthew, your body was found laying unconscious, brutally beaten and hanging from a wooden fence in Laramie, Wyoming. I wish that I could tell you that your death has caused a groundswell of opposition to homophobia. The truth of the matter is, it has not. As educators, we are still afraid to even mention the word gay in our classrooms, much less promote the notion that gays are normal and have that notion become a natural part of the curriculum. The word homosexual has become much like the word nigger. No one ever dares to say the word nigger, but despite their refusal to utter it, the word nigger continues to exist. No one seems to get that it is the fact that we can't say nigger that empowers that word, that gives it life and meaning. It is the fact that there is a word about me as a people group that is so utterly pugnacious that no one dares to say it. No one has made the connection, however, between a word so disdainful it can't be pronounced and being a member of the group for which that word describes. I wish that I could tell you that after your death, the entire community coalesced, curricula were changed in the public schools, and that there was absolute fervor to implement a curriculum that promoted a liberatory pedagogy, but I would be lying. What happened instead, Matthew, was I looked out my window in McWhinney Hall one day and saw a group of Christians who came to campus carrying signs declaring that you were burning in hell and that you deserve to die. They say that religion is the opiate of the masses. That be the case then, This new religious movement is not under the influence of opium. Crack is the new drug of choice. I've never seen such hatred spewed in the name of invisible deities who have left such explicit instructions as who to hate. And Matthew, gays are among that group the deity has left instructions to hate. So these religious zealots have made homophobia their agenda. But they're not just a group on a rampage, they have power. Because this nation is overwhelmingly Christian, they are able to transform their religious beliefs into cultural practice and governmental law. That is the power of dominant groups. We've seen this in other contexts before. In the racial context, the dominant group was able to convert its ideas, attitudes, and hatreds for blacks into centuries of chattel slavery. Because they were the dominant group, they were able to justify our slavery, profit from it, while people stood by and said nothing. They said God wanted this too. It was our place, as dictated by the Bible, that holiest of books, which tells one who to love and who to hate. And thus they were able to translate their religious beliefs into practice and law. Now, that's my point about what we are fighting here, Matthew. We're fighting homophobia, but we should be fighting homophobes. Homophobes are making the rules and enforcing them. Homophobes are sitting in state legislatures, deciding that gays should not have equal rights. Homophobes are attacking gays, killing them, slaughtering them like sheep, and hanging them from fences. And just like it wasn't racism that kept Dorothy Dandridge out of that pool in which she stuck her famous toe, it's not homophobia that is keeping gay people oppressed. We are doing that, Matthew. We are either doing it actively or passively. A lot of white people argue that although they were around in the 50s when blacks were denied rights, they were not culpable because they weren't actually the ones who put up the colored signs and enforced the rules. They argued they didn't have voice. But that is a lie, Matthew. They did have voice, but they said nothing. They may have never put a noose around a black man's neck, but the violence of their silence was present at every lynching. I suspect that most everyone will leave here today and resume their lives as usual. No one will leave here and demand that their children's curricula are altered to include gay people and the notion that gays are normal. No one will stand up in their churches Sunday morning before that glorious white man nailed to a cross and declare that gays are normal. No one will go home and form a community group and demand that gays be afforded the same rights as straight people, to include marriage and the right to openly live in love. No one will do that. I wish that I could tell you, Matthew, that the blacks, the ones who have suffered the same persecution that you have, will leave this building and storm the White House, outraged that the government is perpetrating the same openly institutional bias and hatred toward gays that they have to us. But they will not, Matthew. They will join the chorus of haters in the name of the God that has cursed them. You will matter least to the ones who have suffered most. We, who were declared 3/5 human in Article 1, Section 2 of the United States Constitution. Ironic, isn't it? Because you are like me, Matthew. You are the secret hate that no one publicly acknowledges. You are the thing that we all despise, hope our children don't become or marry. You are the N-word, Matthew, the love that dare not speak its name. So I'm speaking out on your behalf because Dr. King is right. I'm not concerned with what people will think about me today. I'm concerned about how history will record my position. It's easy for us to look back at what we call the past and blame injustice on the ignorance of the times, but we can't see the ignorance of our own times. I assure you that one day We will be ashamed that we had to vote on whether or not gay people should be treated as 5/5 human. But as Dr. King said, it will not be the hateful acts of the unrighteous that will be remembered. We won't remember the Christian group that gathered on campus after your murder with signs declaring you are burning in hell. We won't remember a president who called for a constitutional amendment to make sure that gays are not treated as if they are 5/5 human. We won't remember the preacher who stood in his pulpit and preached homophobia. We won't remember the school board or the teacher or the superintendent who fought vehemently against a social justice curriculum that advocated that all people, black, white, Latino, gay, lesbian, Christian, Muslim, atheist, Buddhist, are all equal to one another. What will be remembered, Matthew, are the people who sat by and watched unrighteous acts happen and said nothing. I promise to speak out, Matthew. I hope all is well where you are. Sincerely yours, Omowale Akintunde. I want you guys to leave here today knowing two things. One is, I could never tell you how honored I am that you've taken this little enterprise that Peggy and I started and turned it into a worldwide phenomenon. This is without doubt the greatest thing I've ever done in my small little life. I thank you so much for inviting me here today to acknowledge that contribution and our founding. And I want to encourage you to not be afraid to speak out, to speak truth to power. I want you to stand up and say what you believe and what is right, even if your voice shakes. Thank you. Thank you.